So to start off part 2 of my Chevy Vega interior modeling project, I have the outer wall here, which was what I had at the end of the last session, and I'm putting in the flooring in it. Now this can be a little bit tricky because ideally you want all of your vertices to connect. The newest versions of Blender allow you to omit this and they'll still give you a more or less usable model. But some games will conflict with this design. For example, Redline requires you mostly to connect your vertices if you want it to actually export properly. So since this might end up in Redline, I am trying to connect the vertices to the extent that I can. I may have to redo it again and again later, but in any case, I'm trying to segment the floor here. It would also be theoretically possible to select all the vertices on the outer edge and then just hit F to fill, but not necessarily a good idea. And notice also that I'm putting 4 segments in the middle there, and of course if you know how a car is designed, especially an old American car, you know that that will be the bell housing for the transmission and drive shaft. You always notice that bell housing in the middle of an old American car, even a Vega. And also notice that I'm going to have to push up the wheel wells in the back there, but that's the next step in putting in the flooring. So if you know what you want at the start of the project, this is a fairly quick and easy thing to do, which is good because I only have 10 minutes. Although what you'll notice is I'll use the loop subdivide tool to make sure, again, that my vertices connect back in the wheel well. And here's my first loop. I line up the first vertex of the wheel well and try a few different views to line it up as close as I can before merging the vertices. Obviously, if you merge the vertices off a bit, it can pull their locations into an asymmetrical position, which you don't want. Especially because I'm not splitting this model in half. The reason being that a car interior is asymmetrical. So doing it in halves is of dubious merit as a strategy to save time. So notice I'm doing one edge across for each of the vertices in the, well, on each side of the wheel well. And using the view tool to line it up to the extent that I can. I'll adjust this later, and as you'll see, whenever you're building a model, you have to constantly recheck the symmetry of it and the locations of your vertices in relation to each other. In particular, if you have a relatively complicated shape to model, like a 1960s or 70s American car, which of course was part of the criticism of the designs, that it harmed aerodynamics. The 50s ones are even crazier, of course. They're some of the hardest American cars to model, hardest cars to model, period, because of the amount of detail. I was actually hoping that the Vega was going to be easy because it was so much simpler than some of the other stuff I had built. But, well, yes and no. So here I'm selecting all the vertices on each of these cross edges, and you see I'm pulling them up to the level of the wheel well sides or cutouts on either side. And then I'm going to merge the vertices by selecting both of them and then Alt M, merging in the center. And I'll adjust later as needed. And the last one, Then I'll repeat on the other side. I'm going to skip over a bit here to save time. And then the bell housing, well, you take the two middle segments, at least the way I'm doing it, and you raise them. Of course, in real life, this would be a little bit rounder. Typically, bell housings on GM cars were round. But this is an interior model that the player will not see very much in the games, so I'm simplifying it a little bit. I'm pushing that cross edge, if you can call it that, up a bit because the transmission portion of the bell housing is belled towards the front because the transmission is tapered, which is typical for a front engine rear wheel drive car. Not true with a front wheel drive actually. So then I shrink the middle section, and of course I'm going to have to stretch it longitudinally because you see when you use the scale tool in Blender, it reduces or increases the size of all sides, all edges at once. So it pulls everything out of alignment if you use it in this way. I'm not completely sure why I'd like to do it this way. I mean, there are criticisms of this technique simply because you have to clean it up later. I think it's because I like the uniformity of it. Because when I put it back into the correct longitudinal size, I can line up the vertices. But again, you could make the same argument, well, why not just scale everything piece by piece in the beginning? I think, again, it's a matter of having to rescale some instead of all. Having reference points. It's completely opinion, I think. It's very hard to really make a solid argument one way or the other. So here I am doing the first of the cleanup. And as you'll see later, I will not be done just because I'm doing this now. So pull that part of the bell housing back. Of course, the rear part of the bell housing holds the differential box. So it, again, tapers out a little bit. And so the fact that this ends up being tapered by accident is a good thing. It's exactly what I want. So then I'm going to try and straighten these cross edges for the simplicity of modeling over the course of the project. The car is kind of boxy, so these should be squared off, I think. I think that's a reasonable line of reasoning. So then as I reach the end of this modeling session, I have to put the sides on for real. By this I mean I want the vertices to connect again. So I'm going to split these sides into two faces each, as opposed to having one face where if you notice that vertex down in the bottom there is not connected, which could present problems later. So I put a new edge at the top and I subdivide it. Both sides, same thing. And I like that vertical edge to be straight, so I move them ahead. Put in the edges. And of course, one thing I'm skipping here is that I also leveled out the floor while I was doing this stage of the project. That took me 5 or 6 minutes, and so I've omitted that from the video because it's, it's tedious and obvious. You always want to recheck your model. And that's it. That side's done, and we have a complete interior model which resembles a tray at this stage.